According to a report by the UNDP, it presents a novel analysis of sovereign credit ratings across African economies. Now, in contrast to the usual focus on bias or pro-cyclicality, the report shows that sometimes mismatched sovereign debt ratings for African nations are primarily due to idiosyncrasies in the dominant approach of the big three credit rating agencies. That, of course, is S&P, Moody's, and Fitch. Now, the report also critically reviews the link between credit ratings and the role of multinational organizations. Well, let's find out more about the findings in that report. Mr. Daouda Sembene is the CEO of Africa Catalyst, and together with the UNDP, he launched this report last year on the sidelines of the IMF annual meetings in DC. Mr. Daouda, great to have you on the show with us. Now, of course, taking a look at that report, the UNDP did point out that these sovereign debt ratings may be influenced by what they called methodological idiosyncrasies rather than African nations' macroeconomic fundamentals. So what are your thoughts on how ratings agencies are approaching and determining Africa's credit ratings?
Well, thank you very much for having me. I think you were referring to that report by UNDP that was launched last year at the event that we co-hosted with them, and that found out that African countries could save up to 74 billion if credit ratings were to base on less subjective assessment. I think that's what you're calling idiosyncrasies. So according to UNDP, is some sort of a degree of subjectivities that affect the assessment by credit ratings on African economies that actually create those issues. Is the fact that the assessment themselves are not very much in line with the macroeconomic fundamentals of African economies. So I think we all know that, of course, any assessment and any evaluation is usually tainted with some subjectivity. And I think at the same time, also, we know that the role of credit rating agencies is critical to assess the ability of countries to pay back their debt, either in full or on time. But the fact that, there is some difficult and challenging task in assessing a country should not be an excuse for not really doing the great job of reducing and making sure that those credit rating assessments are very much faithful, reliable, and of course playing their role. And I believe the issue is how to make sure that, yes, credit rating agencies do the job they need to do, and which is extremely critical, but at the same time, they do it with as less subjectivity as possible, because the subjectivity, of course, costs African countries money, because any subjective credit rating leads to increased costs of servicing their debt.
Well, I'd like to get a sense of how you then think these ratings agencies can better approach rating African nations, given that your research also found that there's a dearth of relevant data here in Africa for these agencies.
Well, certainly, I would think this is a shared responsibility between African countries and credit rating agencies. So on the part of African countries, I think when you talk about the depths of data, the question is how they should organize themselves to get better data and be able to release them in a timely manner. I think that the onus is on the countries to do so. But at the same time, for credit rating agencies, it's important to really keep sort of refining their methodological approach to reduce the subjectivity that I talked about earlier, but also to be able to collect data on the ground in a more effective manner. As you know, some of those credit rating agencies have been criticized for not having a good presence or a sort of important presence in Africa. And I think this is an issue also that needs to be addressed to make sure that at the end of the day, they have what it takes to really collect the data in a very sort of timely manner.
Well, I'd like to get a sense of the damage that has been done, because what has been the cost and impact of this credit ratings on Africa's development agenda?
Stated earlier, when you have inaccurate credit ratings, or at least subjective credit ratings, what you do is you're increasing the cost of borrowing of African countries. And when you increase the cost of borrowing, you're making it harder for them to service their debt, But at the same time, it means that they're paying more than they should be paying. And that additional sort of debt service that they are paying could have been allocated to other priorities that are very much important in terms of investing in health, or sort of investing in education, investing in infrastructure. You were diverting away all of those resources from where they needed to go by inflating unduly the credit rating. So this is extremely important, and of course it has a significant bearing on the ability of African government to make a progress toward their development agenda.
Well, what really then is the alternative going forward? Because we know investors do rely on these three big ratings agencies. You've suggested establishing a multilateral credit rating agency, or even implementing a regional Pan-African rating agency. So what are the alternatives, and what role can multinational organizations play in ensuring that African economies are getting a fair share?
Well, I think we have to say at the beginning that it's hard to find alternative to credit rating agencies because they are much needed. They are much needed to determine the cost of finance, because any investors would like to know what's the ability of their debtor to pay back their debt. The credit rating agencies are also needed to facilitate the movement of capital across countries and across markets, so that we cannot find alternative. But what you can do, and I believe you refer to a suggestion by the African Union to come up with some new credit rating agencies that are based, that covers the continent, and it's not necessarily our suggestion, but the suggestion by the African Union. That may be something that helps. It also could be helpful to empower local credit rating agencies. There are already some credit rating agencies that are operating in Africa, apart from those big three that you talked about. I think it is important also to find how they can do their job better, of course, while being very much independent, because at the end of the day, any credit rating agency cannot be effective if it's not perceived as being independent. So that's another way to do so. But of course, we talked earlier about the need for improving data. I think this is extremely critical, but it's also important to share more transparency on methodologies that are used by credit ratings. And this is what we are trying to do with UNDP. And I think this would be helpful. And last but not least, it's also critical to have an adequate supervisory and regulatory framework under which credit rating agencies, whether they are from the continent or from the big three, would be subjected, so that they can really do their job. I think this is what many advanced economies did in the aftermath of the global financial crisis in 2008. Africa should also follow their suit.